Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're putting on our thinking caps, our metaphorical combat helmets, and diving into a topic that's fascinated military minds for centuries. We're talking about positioning your forces for that, that upper hand, even before
Yeah.
that first shot is fired, right?
And to guide us through the strategic battleground, we're turning to one of the titans of military thought, Carl von Clausewitz.
Oh, Clausewitz, the big guy. His book On War, legendary. We're going deep on this one, folks, specifically Chapter 6 of Book 5, General Disposition of an Army. Buckle up.
Buckle up indeed. What's so fascinating about this chapter, at least for me, is how Clausewitz takes these activities, camping, marching, things that might seem, well, almost routine in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, mundane, day-to-day stuff.
Exactly. He connects them to the larger, the overarching strategy of war. It's all connected, he argues.
It's like he has that great line about the sword. The old way of thinking about armies, it was like a sword, where the blade, the hilt, those were separate pieces. But the new way, well, it's a sword forged from a single piece of metal. Everything's connected.
That is such a powerful analogy. He's highlighting just how those choices you make, even those that seem insignificant, those little things you do every single day in the field.
Like where to set up camp for the night.
Exactly. They can have these huge ripple effects, influencing the overall success or failure of an entire campaign.
Okay, so let's dive into Clausewitz's world here. He starts by pointing out how differently armies used to think about positioning. He talks about Luxembourg's encampments. And this is what got me. Luxembourg would actually set up camp with his back to a river, to a valley, sometimes even a swamp. Talk about a risky move. It seems almost intentionally dangerous. What was he thinking?
I know, right? It completely blows my mind. It really highlights this completely different mindset, almost like a blind spot we have today. Back then, facing the enemy, not always the priority when you chose where to set up camp. It's almost as if being in camp meant you were, taking a break from war itself.
Like a little vacation? Come on.
Well, not quite, but the emphasis was on the comfort of the troops, not strategic advantage.
Wow. So different from how we think today. It reminds me of the phrase Clausewitz uses. He talks about someone going to observe the enemy, il va à la guerre. He's going to war, like it was a casual stroll in the park or something.
Right. It's like back then, even being in the field wasn't truly considered being at war. The mindset has completely shifted.
So when did that change happen? When do we go from prioritizing, a good night's sleep to not getting ambushed in your sleep?
It's a fascinating evolution, actually. Clausewitz, he argues that it happened gradually. And he points to decisive actions battles, for example, as this kind of catalyst. Think of it like this. As battles became more about maneuver, about decisive engagement, it forced commanders to start thinking more strategically about their positioning, even outside of combat.
Because every move mattered more.
Yes. And then that kind of thinking, it spread. It began to influence these other aspects of warfare, the camping, the marching, the things that might have seemed completely unrelated to the heat of battle suddenly. They all became part of the equation.
So those high-stakes battles, they forced everyone to kind of up their game, and those changes trickled down to, every other aspect of how a military operated.
Precisely. Fast forward to today, and we understand that where your troops are when they're not fighting, it's all connected. Whether they're in quarters, on the move, in camp, it all relates directly to that potential for battle, that looming possibility of engagement.
It's all part of this ongoing strategic chess match.
Exactly. And that brings us to those count 'em, seven key considerations that Clausewitz lays out for positioning an army outside of combat. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, especially for our listeners out there who are, in the thick of it in today's world.
Because even though he was writing, centuries ago?
Centuries ago. But these points, they still hold up. I mean, we're talking about things that seem so basic. Making sure your troops can get food that's huge, that they have shelter from the elements.
Most of those are fundamentals.
He calls those first two subsistence and shelter. And they might sound obvious, but you can imagine, even today, a special forces unit operating deep behind enemy lines. Those basic needs, they can quickly become major obstacles that can make or break an entire mission.
Right. Logistics.
Yeah.
Always the logistics. What else is on Clausewitz's list of must-haves for smart positioning?
Well, next up, we've got security of the rear. Basically, having that escape route, that safe line of retreat if things go sideways.
Which, let's be honest, is something you always want to have figured out.
Absolutely. Then he talks about having open country in front of your position. You want to be able to see what the enemy is doing, right? Anticipate their moves.
Visibility is key.
Exactly. But then he kind of flips that on its head and says, Ideally, you want to be positioned in broken country. You want to use the terrain to your advantage. Defense, defense, defense.
So it's like picking your battleground, knowing the terrain like the back of your hand.
Exactly. He then gets into the importance of leveraging strategic point d'appui, and these are those natural barriers or man-made fortifications that can really anchor your defenses.
Setting up your base with those impenetrable mountains at your back, right?
You got it. It's about leveraging the terrain, whether it's natural or something that's been built. And finally, he talks about the suitable distribution of troops. And this is key because you don't want to have all your forces concentrated in one vulnerable spot. You need to spread out, but strategically.
So you can respond to threats, but also stay agile. Maintain that flexibility.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance. And what's amazing is how Clausewitz then takes all of these practical considerations, the food, the shelter, the terrain, and he connects them back to the larger structure of an army and how it operates in the field. He argues that a natural system emerges, usually composed of 4 or 5 main parts, with the advance guard leading the way, the main body at the center, and then often a reserve force, plus those crucial units protecting the flanks.
And this is where his sword analogy comes back into play, right? That idea that it's all connected.
Exactly. He's arguing that when you divide an army into these distinct units, it's not about fighting separate, disconnected battles. It's about creating that flexibility, that ability to respond to the enemy's movements, but always working toward that one decisive moment when the whole force can come together for that unified strike.
It's about being a single, cohesive weapon, even when you're dispersed.
Yes.
Now that is a powerful image.
It really is. It makes you realize how much those 19th century ideas, they still resonate today. It's remarkable.
It's like Clausewitz. He had this knack for cutting through the noise and getting to those timeless truths about strategy, the core of how conflict really works, you know?
Mm.
And what's cool is how these principles we're talking about, they apply beyond the battlefield too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, take his point about, remember, subsistence and shelter. We might not be too worried about, our troops foraging for berries or building log cabins these days.
Hopefully not.
Right. But that principle, just as important as ever, imagine, just picture a modern humanitarian mission, a natural disaster, let's say. You've got troops on the ground, they're providing aid, but everything's chaos. Supply lines are disrupted, they're exposed to the elements, their ability to do their jobs to actually help people, it still hinges on those needs being met.
It's that foundation, right? You can't build anything without it.
Exactly. Those logistical fundamentals, they matter. In combat, out of combat, they can make or break a mission every time.
Okay, I want to circle back to something else Clausewitz talked about, that idea of having, open country in front of your position. It seems a little outdated, right? We've got satellites, we've got drones, we can see everything.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the thing is, even with all this technology, the advantage of good visibility, it hasn't gone away. Think about urban warfare, for instance. Troops that are positioned in a way that lets them observe key intersections, rooftops, those kinds of things, that local on-the-ground awareness. It can be just as valuable, maybe even more so, than some satellite image.
It's like those principles he was talking about, using broken country to your advantage. That takes on a whole new meaning in a city, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Buildings become your hills, streets become your valleys. A skilled commander, they can use those urban canyons to create defensive positions, choke points, the same way armies used to do with natural features. And it goes beyond the physical, too, Think about cybersecurity maintaining clear lines of sight in terms of network traffic, identifying potential weak points. It's all connected.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So it's like those strategic point d'appui that Clausewitz was so into. They're still relevant, but instead of fortresses, we're talking servers and firewalls.
Exactly. The point of support, it might not always be a physical structure anymore, but the function, that stays the same. It's about those anchors, providing depth, providing options, giving you that flexibility you were talking about earlier. And speaking of flexibility, that concept of, remember, suitable distribution of troops. In a world of rapid deployment, global operations, that takes on a whole new dimension, wouldn't you say?
It's not just about where you're camped out for the night anymore.
Not even close. We're talking about having forces positioned all over the globe, ready to respond. Boom, just like that. It's a balancing act, being strategically placed, but also able to concentrate your power when and where you need it. And that's not easy.
It's a global chess game. Every move has consequences.
Yeah.
And speaking of chess, I thought what Clausewitz said about flanking units was really interesting, how we shouldn't think of those units as these little, separate armies off doing their own thing.
He pushes back against that so hard, doesn't he? He uses that great analogy. It's like thinking the wings of an army are weak just because they're on the edges, as if the enemy doesn't have flanks, too.
It's so obvious when you say it like that.
Right. But it's a trap, you know? Military leaders can fall into it so easily, overemphasizing those flanks, treating them like separate entities instead of part of a cohesive whole. And that's a mistake.
So instead of just throwing troops at the flanks, it's about how those units fit into the bigger plan.
Yes, exactly. He talks about those units being like almost like lateral advance guards, slowing things down, buying time for the main force to maneuver, to react. But it's coordinated. They're not off on their own. It's all working towards that same goal, you see.
So it's about recognizing that every unit, every position, it has a role to play in the larger battle.
Beautifully put. And that actually brings us to a point that I think often gets lost in all the discussions about tactics and troop movements, and it's something Clausewitz himself emphasizes. It's the importance of connecting those actions, those things happening on the ground, with the larger, the overarching political goals of the war itself.
It's about remembering the why
Yeah.
behind the fight.
Yes. And that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
It's so easy to get lost in the weeds,
Yeah.
to get so focused on the tactical stuff that we forget about the bigger picture.
It's easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to that bigger picture. Every military operation, it has to serve a purpose, a larger goal.
And for Clausewitz, that purpose always comes back to politics.
Politics, right. He had that famous line, something like, war is just politics by other means.
War is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means.
There you go. You said it better. So it's not just about winning battles. It's about achieving those political goals that were there at the very beginning, the reason you got into the conflict in the first place, right?
Precisely. Otherwise, what are you even fighting for? And this actually ties into another really key concept from Clausewitz that I think we need to talk about: friction.
Okay, hold on. We've gone from camping to marching to flanking maneuvers, and now we're throwing friction into the mix. I'm intrigued, but I need some clarification. What's Clausewitz talking about here?
Well, he's getting at the inherent messiness of war, the unpredictability, that gap between what you plan, what you hope will happen, and then, well, reality.
Like no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Exactly. It's those unexpected things that pop up, the logistical snags, the bad intel, human error, just the fog of war in general. It's all that friction that makes the real world so different from, those perfectly choreographed war games.
I can only imagine. So how do you account for that? Can you ever really be prepared for those kinds of curveballs?
That's where a truly great commander, they set themselves apart. It's about having the judgment to make decisions on the fly, to adapt to those constantly changing circumstances, to roll with the punches, but never, ever lose sight of those larger goals we were talking about.
So it's not just about being a brilliant strategist. It's about being able to think on your feet, to adjust, to improvise when you need to.
Absolutely. And that's why, even though he was writing, almost 200 years ago now, Clausewitz's ideas, they're still being studied today. I mean, the weapons have changed, the tech, it's light years ahead of where it was, but those fundamental truths about war, about that clash of wills, the uncertainty, the friction, that's timeless. That's never going away.
He was able to see past the specifics of his time, identify those core principles that they apply no matter what era, what weapons, what technologies involved.
Exactly. And I think, honestly, that's a really powerful takeaway for anyone in the military. It's not enough to just master the tactics or the equipment, to be proficient with the latest tech. You need to understand the strategic context. You need to connect those individual actions to the political goals that are driving the whole conflict. And you always have to be ready to adapt when things inevitably go off script.
To throw out the playbook and think on your feet. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Clausewitz's general disposition of an army, it's a dense one, folks, but it's packed with insights.
Yeah.
What's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
Think big picture. Every decision, whether it's where you set up camp or how you position those troops for battle, it's all connected. It all matters. And it's not just about winning those individual battles, it's about achieving those larger strategic and political objectives, especially when you're facing chaos and uncertainty.
It's about seeing the battlefield and maybe even the world through that Clausewitzian lens. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of history, science, or culture, right here on The Deep Dive.